I'm absolutely delighted to have been asked to participate in this launch today by Denise and her colleagues at the Community Foundation. It's really wonderful news that this fund has started, and I really do believe that it's going to make a difference. I've been a border hopper all my life, really. People ask me where I live, and I'm always quite torn as to how to answer to that. I live in the south, but I work in the north, and I seem to be always somewhere in between. At this moment, for example, I'm in the north, but speaking to the south, to people, and we hope to people all over the country. It's really great to see some people here, over 200. Often I feel that actually I live in my car, always moving backwards and forwards across an invisible border that has defined my life and many, many others. What is it that happens between Derry and Letterkenny, Enniskillen and Cavan, Newry and Dundalk? No one is sure, but we do know that it has broken hearts and destroyed lives for 100 years now, and generations of people have tried to sort it out one way or the other, and will continue to do so. I say a border, but the truth is anyone who wants or needs to change society in any part of this country knows that they're crossing or attempting to cross all kinds of borders all of the time. I have a new book coming out in a few weeks, which includes interviews with a very diverse range of Northerners from a Protestant background. And I let people talk about whatever mattered to them rather than trying to direct them. Inevitably, there was a lot said about the border and the so-called constitutional question. One woman said to me of a border poll, it's a 20th century answer to a 21st century question. We need to be thinking globally. And she's right, we do. But of course, and she acknowledges this, we also need to be thinking locally. And that's where the All Ireland Community Fund comes in. Bright, shining, and quite honestly, one of the best ideas I've heard of on this island for a very long time. Of course, as people have mentioned already, there has been cross-border funding before now. We've had successive rounds of EU peace funding. We've had the Department of Foreign Affairs Reconciliation Fund, the International Fund for Ireland, Cooperation Ireland, the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, and others. All have made a tremendous contribution, but this fund is very particularly targeted at civil society groups of a particular kind that are trying to create new spaces within this divided island at a time when new stresses are threatening to rip us apart again, as well as new opportunities are offering exciting prospects for our imaginations. When Denise and Francis outlined the fund to me, I immediately thought about sewing, especially those big, long, useful stitches that sewing machines can do to mend a bad tear in a piece of cloth. Also, the kind of stitches a nurse can put in place to hold together the edges of a wound until it begins to heal itself. And I remembered suddenly the lovely Soften the Border installation that the artist Rita Duffy put together, along with women from the villages and countryside around Belcoo in County Fermanagh and Black Lion in County Cavan during the Brexit negotiations. For those of you who don't know that beautiful watery part of the country, Belcoo and Black Lion are separated by a river, connected by a bridge. And for a festival weekend in 2017, that bridge was festooned with birds with lace feathers, with spinning crocheted eyes and knitted beaks, cats with shoelace whiskers, and lots of sky dancing dolls with rainbow coloured clothes, smiling faces, and wild, wild woolly hair. I see now that those dolls were trying to tell us something about a future without hairdressers. Duffy said, "We're knitting the border together." The Belfast-born artist had not long moved to the border area when she said that. "I'm quite surprised," she said. "I always thought of this," meaning the two villages, "as a semi-detached village, but these communities work together hand in glove. People actually cooperate and look after each other. We should be doing that locally, and we should be doing it universally as well." I actually worked in that area on the border myself in the early 1990s. It was a very strange experience. I was a community worker with an EU-funded project called Rural Action. For the most part, my job was to help local groups to apply for funds. I remember being really proud when I helped to steer through a small grant for an elderly woman who was living alone in a cottage on an island in Lough Erne. The fund was for what were known as distressed gentlefolk, and she was a fierce Republican. It seemed very fitting. I'd only lived in northern cities before that time, and it took me a while to understand rural border society. At first, I couldn't understand why in one village, two small separate groups would want me to help them to get large amounts of money to replace the roofs on two vast mausoleums of community halls a few hundred yards from each other. Then again, that small village also had two pubs, two housing estates, two garages, two shops. According to demography, counting the number of Catholics and Protestants, that is, these villages were mixed. But in a very real sense, they were not. I soon learned that fear and distrust that violence had instilled in people was the reason for that. It was too dangerous to share buildings. Horse trading went on between groups to get safe members of the other side of the house onto community councils, given the requirement from many funders at that time for groups to be cross-community. I began to see each of those small villages as two villages hovering over each other in which people coexisted in a kind of shadow dance. I had a friend whose small farm was divided by the Woodford River, which is tracked by the border for a stretch. Her house was in the north. After the bridge was blown up, she told me that the bull from the Free State, as she still called it, used to swim across to get to her cows. But even during the worst of the conflict, people did cooperate. They did quietly and sometimes even secretly support each other, both within divided communities in the north and on both sides of the border. How could it be otherwise? There's one route that anyone who has driven from, say, Ballyshannon in the far west to the far eastern side of the country beyond Cullaville and South Armagh will know. You cross the border so many times you'd lose count if there was any sign of it, which thankfully there isn't anymore, and long may it remain so. The border, of course, isn't a line, it's a region, and it's a region that has been disadvantaged because it is the margin of two states. It has a raw, unhemmed edges in its interior. As a journalist, I always made real efforts to write about the whole of Ireland, especially when writing about social issues. But I was often defeated. North and South are culturally very similar. Both, for example, are patriarchal societies with massively under-acknowledged rates of male violence against women and children. I used to try to include facts about legislation on both sides of the border and statistics from feminist organisations, but it just took too many words that seemed better spent telling women's urgent stories. Often the stats North and South were collated differently. It just didn't work. But one of the amazing things that have begun to happen is the bonding of campaigning groups on both sides of the border. I remember being involved in a very small scale in this in 1983 in the run-up to the disastrous insertion of the notorious 8th Amendment into the Constitution. I was working in the Belfast Rape Crisis Centre and a group of us did a bit of leafleting for the anti-amendment campaign in Donegal. In 2018, as a journalist, I travelled from Belfast to Cavan Town with an extremely well-organised group of Northern women who were lending their support to the Repeal the 8th movement. One of them was the artist Laura O'Connor, who had lived on both sides of the border and whose installation, Uncomfortable State, was then showing. One video showed her lying on the map of Ireland, gradually erasing her body with grass. The North is Next is an ongoing project. In many ways, women have no country. We have to stake our claim wherever we are. We have to clear spaces for ourselves. And we must, as a nation, always have solidarity with those who have crossed other, far more difficult borders to get here, including asylum seekers who are treated like people without rights in both jurisdictions of this country. Anyone who's been on a cross-border bus or train and seen Black people singled out by the police for searching and questioning will be familiar with that sense of shame that evidence of racism stirs, and rightly so, in all of us. Groups working on cross-border health issues know that sometimes asylum seekers have to make immense journeys to get healthcare because they cannot legally cross the border. Brexit has complicated everything, and COVID has exacerbated all the old tensions. In the North, with depressing inevitability, the pandemic has even been sectarianised. A new divide is opening right now between the vaccinated North and the still waiting South. There is so much work still to be done, and so much will fall to the kind of groups that the All Ireland Fund is aimed at, including those for whom small grants will make an immense difference.